Today we're going to talk about drawing conclusions. When we draw a conclusion, we are trying to form an opinion or decide something. So we're going to make an opinion or deciding something. We use our background knowledge and facts and details from a story to form a conclusion. We check our conclusion by asking, is this the only logical choice, and are the facts accurate? So let's look at this story. Sam is trying to do his homework, but it is so noisy. Other kids are talking and laughing all around him. The engine is so loud and the brakes squeak every time they stop, which is often. Where is Sam? So we're going to be asking, where is Sam? Is he at school, on an airplane, or on a school bus? Well, if we look at the story, Sam is trying to do homework. So I would say here we have that. He says it's so noisy. So in our detail 1, I wrote it is so noisy because the kids are what? Talking and laughing. Detail 2, why else can't he do his homework? He said the engine is so loud. So that was my detail number 2. The third detail was the brakes squeak every time he stops. So every time he stops, my third detail is the brakes squeak, and they stop often. So the conclusion, where is Sam? What do you think he's on? Remember, right here, drawing conclusions. Readers use details from a text to help them arrive at a new understanding. So this one, we can say, this leads me to believe, after all of these, it's so noisy because kids are laughing and talking, the engine is loud, and the brakes squeak when they stop, and they stop often. Also, I'd like to point out doing homework's important here. So I would say he's probably not on an airplane. Do you think he's at school or on a school bus? That's right. I would say here, Sam is on a school bus. Very good. Okay, if we look at these 3 clues today, up here we have the first detail, I cannot walk or talk. Okay, my detail number 2, I drink from a bottle. And detail number 3, I sleep in a crib. And the conclusion we need to find out is, who am I? Well, we could say on this first one, I know babies cannot do these things yet. Detail 2, I drink from a bottle. I could say, well, I know babies drink from a bottle. And number 3's detail, I sleep in a crib. I might say, I know babies sleep in a crib. So then I could go down here and look at my conclusion. I would say, this makes me think that this must be a baby. Who am I? We must be a baby. Another way to look at these clues, if we did it on a different graphic organizer and we looked at digging for a deeper meaning up here, digging for a deeper meaning. And the question still is, who am I? So the conclusion you're going to come to is who this is. And if I had the story and I said my observations from reading were, I cannot walk or talk. Well, if I use my experiences, I would probably first say that I know non-living things can't walk or talk. If I go to my second observation, I drink from a bottle. I might tell you from my experiences that babies and baby animals drink from bottles. If I go to my third observation, I sleep in a crib. And my experience, I would say, I know that human babies sleep in a crib. Therefore, the conclusion I'm going to draw is that it must be a baby. It's really important to think about inferences and drawing conclusions when you draw conclusions because they're very similar. Very similar. So inferences. Making an inference is the process of figuring out missing information that is included. We can infer with pictures and text. We infer points related to our characters, the plot, setting, and even vocabulary. And inferences require facts from our text, our own background knowledge related to the situation, and the ability to think about what's not directly seen or read. And if we go to both, if we go over here to just drawing conclusions, conclusions are judgments or decisions reached based on information learned. It requires reasoning or deep thinking and observation skills. You still use your inferences in your conclusions, but your conclusion is that judgment or decision. So we draw conclusions to solve a mystery or figure out the problem or the question. Drawing conclusions is deeper than inference. And making inferences help us draw conclusions. And we need to know information from the story to consider our experiences as well to figure out the question why. And if we go to both of them right here, making inferences and drawing conclusions are very similar and often confused. But why? This is because it seems as though we are gathering the same information. The important things to keep in mind are: pay attention to the facts you learn in your reading and record them. With both inferences and conclusions, we must consider our own experiences. And finally, we make decisions about the missing information, and those missing information pieces are our inferences. And the end result is the conclusion. So, what we use along the way are our inferences. We kind of fill in those gaps of missing information that isn't told to us in a story. And we use all those informations like little puzzle pieces and put it together to draw the conclusion or the end result to answer that question, why? Okay, we're going to try this graphic organizer again after we read a passage, so please listen. Class, the reptile handler from the Burbank Zoo is here to present some reptiles to you, said Mrs. McFerrin. The first thing he presented was a baby crocodile. Barnaby's hands began to sweat just thinking about the scaly creature with the rows of razor-sharp teeth. I would like a volunteer to help me demonstrate this awesome creature, said the handler in an enthusiastic voice. I would like for you to help. The handler pointed at Barnaby. His blood began to run cold. I didn't even raise my hand to volunteer, thought Barnaby, but he shakily went up to the front anyway. All right, so some observations from my reading was that his hands were sweaty. And I know from my experience that my hands sweat when I'm nervous. So what I conclude is that Barnaby is nervous, right? He's nervous. The next thing I noticed from my observation was his blood went cold. And I know people get cold when they're scared. So what I conclude, Barnaby's scared. The next thing I noticed from my observations was that he didn't volunteer. And from my experience, you don't volunteer if you don't want to do something. So I would conclude that he doesn't want to touch the crocodile. And the last thing I noticed, my observation from this story, is that he shakily went up. And I know from my own experience that people who are shaky could be nervous. So I conclude that Barnaby is nervous. So I'm going to think about all these things and draw a conclusion. After reading that passage and filling out the graphic organizer, and knowing that Barnaby's hands began to sweat, he also said he didn't volunteer, right? His blood began to run cold. He said, I didn't raise my hand to even volunteer. Yes? So those were the things that we said would help us come to the conclusion that I'm drawing is that Barnaby was nervous about helping with the baby crocodile. Let's read another passage and draw a conclusion about Chris. Chris, be sure you stay close to the diving instructor when we begin our descent into the water, Lucas said. No problem. I've got this, Chris replied. As they dove deep below the ocean's surface, the friends and their instructor saw many amazing sights. Tropical fish and coral were all around. They even saw an eel and some starfish. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a gigantic shark as big as an elephant appeared. Chris and Lucas looked at each other with wide eyes. The instructor signaled to them to stay calm, and soon the shark swam slowly away. When they surfaced, Chris shouted, "That was awesome and terrifying all at the same time." Lucas replied with a shaky voice, "I'm glad you thought it was awesome because that's not quite how I'm feeling." So after reading that story, again, I'm filling out this digging deeper for meaning graphic organizer. Let's go over some things. So my first observations that I made was that Lucas told Chris to stay close. And from my experience here, you stay close to the person in charge if you aren't sure what you're doing. And so what I would conclude from this was that maybe the boys aren't experienced divers and Lucas may be nervous. The second observation I made was that the boys looked at each other with wide eyes after they saw the shark when they came back up. And I would say that people look with wide eyes when they are shocked or shaken up by something. And so what I conclude from this was that both boys were shocked by seeing the shark. The third observation I made from the reading was Chris says, "That's awesome." And I know that if you say something's awesome, it means you think it's cool. And so I drew the conclusion that Chris thought the shark sighting was extremely cool. And the last observation I made from the reading was Lucas replied in a shaky voice that we weren't feeling the same way, that he wasn't feeling the same way. And people who use a shaky voice when they are scared. So I would say that the shark sighting scared Lucas. In conclusion over here, the conclusion I'm going to draw is that Chris is a more adventurous and braver than Lucas. But on the flip side, you could also say that Lucas is more cautious and less confident than Chris, right? Very good. And remember, the author didn't tell me any of these conclusions. I used observations from the reading and my own experiences to make inferences, and then drew some judgments and opinions. And my final conclusions are my opinions are that Chris is more adventurous and brave than Lucas, and that Lucas is more cautious and less confident than Chris. To sum up drawing conclusions, we do have to use inferences. Inferences are figuring out something that wasn't completely explained in the story. We use what we already know. Use your background knowledge. But then drawing conclusions is taking all those inferences, using them to form a big idea, which is your judgment or your opinion. So you use a judgment, you make a judgment, or an opinion when we draw a conclusion. And we can use our background knowledge, text clues like I did on the previous graphic organizers, and we form that conclusion. And remember, that conclusion is a judgment or an opinion. Let's look over here. Drawing conclusions. What is a conclusion? A conclusion is a judgment or decision that is formed after a period of thought. Okay, and those thoughts are inferences, and you usually have more than one to draw a conclusion. To form a conclusion, we have to look at what the text says plus what we already know, our background knowledge. And a lot of times we make inferences to fill those in. So my conclusion, remember that your conclusion may be different than classmates because we all have different background knowledge. All right? Okay, finally, putting two and two together. When you make inferences, you're putting together something that you have read or observed with something you already knew. So think of these as little pieces of the puzzle. When we draw a conclusion, we put together two or more things that you have read and observed. So you take those inferences right here and it becomes a bigger piece of the puzzle. Good inferences and conclusions are based on good information and smart thinking. So we need those inferences, those small pieces of inferences where we use our background knowledge to put all those inferences together, to put that puzzle all together, and that's when we draw our final conclusion. And we use good information and thinking, and your drawing conclusions are based on a judgment or an opinion.